Space can be extremely dangerous. With almost everything in it out to kill you, the last thing you want is a system failure, further reducing your chances of survival. In today's video, we take a look at some of the most heart-stopping close calls that astronauts and spacecraft have experienced while exploring the final frontier. From malfunctioning equipment to miscalculations, these incidents have tested the limits of human ingenuity and bravery. Join us as we revisit these incredible moments and the heroes who overcame them. Of all the things that you could die from in space, drowning is definitely the last one on anyone's mind. Where would that water even come from? Well, you'd be surprised to know that not one, not two, but at least 3 astronauts have almost drowned in space. Here's one example. Colonel Luca Parmitano is an astronaut for the European Space Agency. In 2013, he served as flight engineer for Expeditions 36 and 37, part of a long-duration mission to the ISS. During the mission, he was tasked with performing up to 3 spacewalks. Now, if you ask anyone, they'll tell you that spacewalks can be extremely tedious and dangerous. But what they don't tell you is you can potentially drown during one. And that's exactly what happened to Parmitano. After a first successful spacewalk, Parmitano was out for a second one when he started to feel his helmet filling up with water. Strange. He reported the situation to NASA, but they didn't think it was serious enough to warrant any change of plan. The water kept trickling in, and because of low gravity, the droplets started to pool in his nose, ears, and eyes, blocking Parmitano's senses and his ability to breathe well. As if things weren't bad enough, the ISS was experiencing an orbital sunset, making seeing even more impossible, as Parmitano planned out how he would get back to the space station. The situation finally got bad enough that Mission Control officially ordered him to return to the airlock, but he was essentially flying blind at this point, unable to hear well or communicate, and trying his hardest not to breathe water into his lungs. So what did he do? Parmitano began flipping in space to try to change the direction of the water in his helmet. How crazy is that? Fortunately, Parmitano was able to make his way back to the space station, and his amazing team helped him to remove the water-filled helmet. He later described the sensation of water covering his nose as unbearable. What if he had actually drowned? The incident startled NASA, and engineers discovered that contaminants had blocked one of the suit's filters, resulting in a backup of water from the cooling system. But this close call wasn't enough for NASA to replace the spacesuit. Another astronaut would also suffer a similar fate. Timothy Copra also complained of a water leak just like Parmitano's while wearing the same spacesuit, almost killing him as well. Two years after the Challenger disaster, NASA was in full swing again, and after a successful mission by Discovery, it seemed to everyone like normal service had resumed. So, a secret mission aboard the Space Shuttle Atlantis was launched on December 2, 1988. The mission was simple: deliver a payload. That was all that could be said due to this mission's classified nature. The launch wasn't even made public until a week before takeoff. The 5 astronauts aboard the spacecraft were Robert Gibson, Guy Gardner, Mike Mullane, Jerry Ross, and Bill Shepard. The launch seemed to go off without a hitch, and the team continued their mission, never expecting to wake up the next day to devastating news.
Went up from NASA immediately that should you come upon what looks to be a piece of debris from this.
Footage of the launch showed that a large piece of debris had broken off the spacecraft shortly after liftoff, hitting its Thermal Protection Shield, TPS. Now, severe damage to the TPS would mean almost certain destruction upon re-entry. The crew sent images of the damage to Mission Control, but after a brief inspection of these rather low-quality images, they deemed the damage not to be severe enough and decided to proceed with re-entry as usual. On December 6, 1988, the crew fired Atlantis' engines for the return to Earth. They were just passing over the Pacific Ocean when Mullane noticed that the spacecraft's belly was heating up excessively. There were no indicators to suggest what was happening, but the crew knew something was wrong. Mission Commander Robert Gibson was certain the crew was going to die. He knew it had something to do with the tiles that had been damaged during launch. Somehow, the crew was able to land the space shuttle successfully at Edwards Air Force Base in California. It was only when the crew had exited the shuttle that they were able to ascertain the full extent of the damage, and it was massive. More than 700 tiles were damaged, with at least 300 of them experiencing severe damage. One entire tile was missing completely. It was obvious to everyone that Mission Control had made a mistake in their analysis and that the crew had very narrowly escaped death. If anything had happened to the STS-27 team, the disaster would have meant the end for NASA. Of course, they would later pay the price during STS-107, the tragic Space Shuttle Columbia disaster of 2003. Anyone who plans on going to space has to be sturdy, and they don't come much sturdier than astronaut Neil Armstrong. The first man on the moon managed to cheat death more than 5 times before his famous moon landing. As a naval aviator, Armstrong was involved in several plane crashes that could all have easily led to his death, but none came as close as the crash he survived while testing the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle, LLRV. It happened on May 6, 1968, only a year before the historic moon landing. At the time, astronauts had to go through intense training to prepare for the moon landing mission, and sometimes the training was as dangerous as the mission itself. Armstrong was to perform a routine test on the LLRV, a vehicle he had already flown at least 20 times before he had his shave with disaster. During the test mission, he lost control of the LLRV due to a mechanical failure and began spiraling down to his doom. Always the cool customer, Armstrong was able to eject himself out of the LLRV 200 feet, 60 meters above the ground, literally seconds before the vehicle crashed and blew up to bits. A fatal crash would have changed history as we know it. Who knows, maybe you would have been the first man on the moon. Have you ever wondered where space stations and spacecraft go when they are no longer in use? The answer is Point Nemo. Located in the South Pacific Ocean and as far from any landmass as you can be, it is the most isolated point on Earth. Point Nemo is popular in the space industry for being the graveyard for decommissioned spacecraft and satellites. But what happens when circumstances cause a spacecraft to overshoot its watery plunge? The people of Capitan, Bermudez, got first-hand lessons when Salyut 7 returned to Earth. Salyut 7 was a space station in low Earth orbit, and the 8th space station to ever be launched. It operated for about 9 years when it was determined that it needed to be retired and returned to Earth. Extremely high solar activity at the time increased atmospheric drag and accelerated the station's orbital decay, forcing it to make an early re-entry to Earth. The space station was meant to disintegrate upon re-entry, with any remaining parts falling into a watery grave at Point Nemo. But a lack of precise analysis and an uncontrolled re-entry meant the Salyut 7 could land anywhere, and it chose Argentina. As the space station came hurtling through the Earth's atmosphere in February of 1991, it began to break up into tiny parts, most of which rained down on the citizens of Capitan, Bermudez in Argentina. It must have been a sight. One minute you're sipping coffee in your front yard, the next you start seeing chunks of fiery metal falling from the skies. It was a scene straight out of a sci-fi movie. Luckily, none of the debris injured or killed any of the town's citizens, but it is still remembered as a very close call. On to the last. Following the successful moon landing of Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins, NASA decided it was time to embark on another mission to the moon. To do this, they sent 3 astronauts, Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert and Fred Hayes, aboard the Apollo spacecraft, which consisted of 2 separate modules joined end-to-end by a tunnel. There was a command module or orbiter known as Odyssey and a service module or lander known as Aquarius. The crew launched on April the 11th, 1970. For the most part, the mission went smoothly. The team was even joking around that everything was so smooth it was almost boring. That is until approximately 56 hours into the mission. On April the 13th, 1970, the crew was closing in on the moon when Mission Control noticed a low-pressure warning signal on the hydrogen tank in the Odyssey orbiter. It was a normal occurrence, and to fix it, the crew aboard Apollo 13 only had to do what is referred to as a cryo-stir. This entailed heating and fanning the gas inside the hydrogen tank to prevent it from settling. From there, the seemingly smooth trip to the moon became one of the most perilous space trips ever recorded. Swigert had only initiated the cryostir when an explosion occurred. It was so intense that it rocked the entire spacecraft. It most certainly rocked the hearts of all 3 astronauts aboard the spacecraft as well. Immediately, the crew reported the situation to Mission Control with the famous "Houston, we have a problem" line. They reported that they could see the spacecraft venting out gas. It would later be discovered that there was a problem with one of the oxygen tanks in the spacecraft. To make the situation worse, there were some wires exposed near the oxygen tank, essentially turning Apollo 13 into a bomb. The crew was losing oxygen, and they were losing it fast. The oxygen not only kept the crew alive, but it also powered Odyssey. If they had continued to operate as usual, the oxygen would have been used up quickly, sealing the crew's fate of a slow and painful death. Luckily, the team was able to escape to the lander that we mentioned earlier, Aquarius. But Aquarius wasn't designed for re-entry. Whether they liked it or not, the crew knew that their only chance at a safe return was with Odyssey, so they shut its systems down in order to conserve energy for re-entry. As U-turns are not exactly an option in space, the crew had to plot a new course back to Earth that had them swing past the moon, the closest they could ever get to their moon landing dreams. It was a bumpy ride home to say the least, but after 4 days of freezing temperatures, little food and water, and a lot of trepidation, the team pulled off a miraculous re-entry. On April 17, 1970, Lovell, Swigert and Hayes landed safely in the Pacific Ocean. The historic mission would force NASA to make necessary adjustments to the spacecraft design, making space travel that little bit safer. The events of this close call would also inspire the award-winning Apollo 13 movie. Do you remember witnessing any of these close calls? If so, please share your experiences in the comments below.